to Auntie Sermons, the podcast. I'm Crystal J., your auntie and your host. I write and perform every episode of Auntie Sermons where we decenter men and ask women to step up and take the mic. Together, we're going chronologically and methodically through the Bible, telling the stories of every named and unnamed woman. For centuries, we've been told the stories of Abraham, Moses, David, Paul, and Jesus. It's time we start understanding who the women were, why their stories were erased, and how that erasure has affected the world around us. So grab your Bible, a highlighter, something to drink, and get comfortable. Let's get started with another sermon about one of the many women of the Bible whose story has been pushed to the margins. Welcome back to Auntie Sermons, the podcast. I'm your host, Crystal J. Today, we're going to do things a little differently. In our last episode, we met Judith and Basemath and saw how later interpreters changed their names to turn them into a moral lesson. But that raises an important question. Why did their names change in the first place? In today's episode, we're going to dig a little deeper. We'll talk about biblical scholarship, documentary hypothesis, and something scholars call doublets, where the same tradition appears more than once in different forms. But we're also going to ask a much bigger question. Why does Esau's story end with yet another woman being expected to solve a problem that wasn't hers to begin with? Instead of asking parents to confront their own prejudice or ask Esau to wrestle with his own choices, the burden once again falls on a woman. So today we'll meet Mahalath, Oholibamah, and another Basemath as we untangle one of Genesis' most confusing family trees and ask what these stories have taught us about women, responsibility, and whose job it is to fix a broken family. Let's get into it. Auntie Sermons, Episode 16, Mahalath, Oholibamah, Basemath, and the problem with Esau's wives. The problem with Esau's wives. This sermon, we're going to do things a little differently. Usually in Auntie Sermons, we focus on one woman or maybe a small group, and we tell their story. We sit with their story. We ask who they were, what happened to them, what the text says about them, and what the text refuses to say about them. But today, we're dealing with a messy group of women whose stories are tangled together in one of the most confusing genealogical messes in Genesis. Today, we are talking about Esau's wives. And as we read these verses together, I want you to pay attention because there's a problem with the list. Now, I know we've already covered a few of Esau's wives before, Judith and Basemath. And today, we're going to talk about them again. But as I continued deeper into the genealogy and came across Mahalath, my research started getting muddy. The names didn't line up. The fathers didn't always line up. The women seemed to disappear and then suddenly reappear. One name gets reused for what may be an entirely different woman. And depending on which chapter you're reading, you can walk away thinking Esau had 3 wives, 4 wives, or 6 wives. So today, we're going to do something important. We're going to stop pretending difficult passages don't exist. We're going to read the verses honestly. We're going to ask why the text looks this way. We're going to talk about textual criticism. We're going to talk about doublets. We're going to talk about the documentary hypothesis. We're going to talk about why scholars began noticing that some stories in Genesis appear layered together from multiple traditions. And yes, today's sermon is going to get scholarly because women cannot afford to be discouraged from education. If we are going to tell these women's stories honestly, then when the text becomes complicated, we cannot just hand wave it away with, well, God said it, so don't ask questions, or, well, it's been translated so many times. No, we cannot keep making excuses for ignorance. We have to ask questions. We have to learn. We have to study because uneducated people are easier to control. And women especially have historically been punished for asking difficult questions about religion, history, and power. So today we're going to do the opposite. Today we're going to lean into the complexity. We are going to hear what the rabbi said. We are going to hear what Christian apologists say. We are going to hear what modern scholars say. And then after all of that, we are going to bring it back to the women themselves, because underneath all the confusion, all the genealogy, all the arguments over sources and traditions and contradictions, there are still women here. Women whose names shift, whose identities blur together, whose stories became unstable depending on who was telling them. Today's sermon is the problem with Esau's wives. The wives of Esau are introduced. So let's start where we should always start, with the text itself, because before we can talk about contradictions, before we can talk about doublets, before we can talk about source traditions and the documentary hypothesis, we need to actually read the verses. And as we read them, I want you to pay attention to the names. Pay attention to the fathers. Pay attention to who appears and who disappears, because this is where the problem begins. This is where I saw the tension. This is where, frankly, I got confused doing my research. The first time Esau's wives are introduced is in Genesis 26. Genesis 26:34 through 35 says, when Esau was 40 years old, he took as wife Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. They grieved Isaac's and Rebekah's spirits. So here we are introduced to two women, Judith and Basemath, both connected to Hittite families. And the text immediately tells us something important. These marriages upset Isaac and Rebekah. And we talked about that in the last episode because that tension matters. It becomes part of the story later. Then we move forward to Genesis 28, and this is where another woman enters the story. Esau saw that the daughters of Canaan didn't please Isaac, his father. Esau went to Ishmael and took, in addition to the wives that he had, Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebaioth, to be his wife. Now pay attention to the wording there, in addition to the wives that he had. Meaning Judith and Basemath are still already present in the story, and now Esau adds Mahalath. Why? Because he realizes his parents disapprove of his marriages. So instead of changing himself, because why would a man do that? He adds another woman. Remember that, because we're going to be coming back to that later. Now we jump ahead again to Genesis 36, and suddenly the list changes. Genesis 36:2-3 says, Esau took his wives from the daughters of Canaan, Adah, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, Oholibamah, the daughter of Adah, the daughter of Zibeon the Hivite, and Basemath, Ishmael's daughter, sister of Nebaioth. Now wait a minute, because suddenly Judith is gone. Adah appears, Mahalath disappears, Basemath appears again, but this time she is Ishmael's daughter, and Oholibamah suddenly enters the story too. Are you seeing the problem now? Can you see why I got confused? Because this is no longer a clean genealogy. The names don't line up, the fathers don't line up, and depending on which chapter you're reading, you can end up with entirely different lists of women attached to Esau. And then what do you do with that when you're trying to write a sermon for every woman, named or unnamed? Frankly, I wasn't really sure what I should do with it. The women, their names, and the problem with the list. Now, before we go any deeper into the scholarship, I want to stop for a moment and actually look at these women themselves, because that's what I'm doing here, right? That's what we're all doing. We want to learn about these women. One of the things I say over and over again in Auntie Sermons is that names matter. Ancient people cared deeply about names. Names could reflect identity, family, hope, status, religion, personality, or even the circumstances surrounding someone's birth. And sometimes in the Bible, names became part of the storytelling itself. Justin and I actually talked about that this week when we talked about this sermon. We talked about how sometimes if you read the names in the Bible, the names themselves tell you something about the character. Almost like whoever preserved the story remembered the trait before they remembered the person. Kind of like nicknames become identities. Like someone becoming known as Fat Albert, Red Skeleton, Carrot Top, a physical trait, a personality trait, something memorable that slowly becomes attached to the person themselves. So before we talk about why the list is messy, let's actually look at the women in the list. The first woman introduced is Judith. Judith is introduced in Genesis 26 as the daughter of Beeri the Hittite. Her name comes from the same root as Judah and is usually understood to mean praised woman or woman of praise. And honestly, that is a strong name. In Esau's household, Judith is one of the first two wives we meet. She is one of the women who becomes part of the family conflict because Genesis tells us these marriages grieved Isaac and Rebekah. Then we have Basemath. And this is where the problem begins because there are two Basemeths in the Esau wife material. The first, Basemath, is introduced in Genesis 26 as the daughter of Elon the Hittite. Basemath is usually understood to mean fragrance, perfume, or sweet smelling. And I actually think that's interesting because fragrance language in the ancient world often carried ideas of attractiveness, desirability, luxury, beauty, and status. This Basemath is connected to the Hittite family line through Elon. She is introduced alongside Judith as one of the wives whose marriage to Esau grieved Isaac and Rebekah. Then we get to Mahalath. Mahalath is introduced in Genesis 28 as the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son and the sister of Nebaioth. And Mahalath is where things start getting interesting because scholars debate her name a bit. Depending on the Hebrew root being used, Mahalath can possibly mean sickness, weakness, or disease. But other scholars connect it to music and instruments, giving meanings closer to song, musician, or stringed instrument. And those are wildly different emotional meanings. One interpretation sounds tragic, the other sounds artistic. In Esau's household, Mahalath enters the story after Esau realizes that the daughters of Canaan did not please Isaac. So Mahalath is not just another wife in the list. She is the wife Esau adds after he realizes there is a family problem. He sees that his parents are upset about his marriages, and instead of changing himself, he brings in another woman. We are absolutely coming back to that. Then we have Adah. Adah appears in Genesis 36 as the daughter of Elon the Hittite. Adah usually means ornament, adornment, or beauty, and that fits a pattern we see repeatedly with women's names in Genesis, where women are often linguistically tied to beauty, desirability, or presentation. Her family connection is the important clue because in Genesis 26, Basemath is the daughter of Elon the Hittite. But in Genesis 36, Adah is the daughter of Elon the Hittite. So many interpreters look at that and say, wait, is Adah the same woman as Basemath? Did the same woman get remembered under two names? Or are we dealing with two different traditions? Then we get to Oholibamah. And yes, I know half of us feel like we need a phonics lesson every time we try to say that name. Oholibamah appears in Genesis 36 as the daughter of Adah and the daughter or granddaughter of Zibeon the Hivite. Her name is generally understood to mean tent of the high place, tent of the hill, or tent of the high place of worship. And that is a fascinating name because it may carry religious or cultic-like associations connected to elevated worship sites, which honestly makes her sound mysterious as hell compared to some of the other wives. In Esau's household, Oholibamah appears in the Genesis 36 wife list. But here's the problem. She does not appear back in Genesis 26. In Genesis 26, the woman listed with Basemath is Judith. But in Genesis 36, Judith is gone and Oholibamah is there. So now we have to ask, did Judith disappear? Did Oholibamah replace her? Are Judith and Oholibamah supposed to be the same woman? Are these two different traditions being put beside each other? Then we have Basemath again. But this time Basemath is not the daughter of Elon the Hittite. In Genesis 36, Basemath is Ishmael's daughter and the sister of Nebaioth. And that matters because that is exactly how Mahalath was described in Genesis 28. Mahalath is the daughter of Ishmael and the sister of Nebaioth. Basemath in Genesis 36 is the daughter of Ishmael and the sister of Nebaioth. So this second Basemath appears to line up with Mahalath, which means Basemath may be the name used in one tradition while Mahalath is the name used in another. And that's why this genealogy gets so messy. Now, let's put the lists side by side. Genesis 26 gives us Judith, daughter of Beeri the Hittite, Basemath, daughter of Elon the Hittite. Genesis 28 gives us Mahalath, daughter of Ishmael, sister of Nebaioth. Genesis 36 gives us Adah, daughter of Elon the Hittite, Oholibamah, daughter of Adah, connected to Zibeon the Hivite. Basemath, daughter of Ishmael, sister of Nebaioth. So now you can see the problem clearly. Basemath changes identity. In one place she is connected to Elon the Hittite. In another place she is connected to Ishmael. Mahalath appears to become Basemath. Judith disappears. Adah appears. Oholibamah may be replacing Judith, but that is the messiest and least clean connection. And this is where I had to stop and ask, are these different women? Are these the same women with different names? Are these different traditions that got combined together? Because when you are trying to write a sermon for every named or unnamed woman in Genesis, this matters. If Adah and Basemath are the same woman, do I preach them separately? If Mahalath and Basemath are the same woman, do I treat them as two women or one? If Judith disappears and Oholibamah appears, what do I do with that? And honestly, that is why this sermon has to deal with the problem directly. Because these women are not being remembered in one clean, unified family line. Their names shift, their fathers shift, their identities blur. And before we jump to the rabbis or the apologists or the scholars, we needed to actually sit with that problem. Because underneath all of this confusion, there are still women here. Women with names, women with family connections, women with roles in Esau's household, women whose identities became unstable in the text itself. What is textual criticism? Now, before we go any further, I want you to know that I'm going to start using some terms that are used in biblical scholarship, and you might hear these terms sometimes when you're watching videos online and listening to people like Dr. Joshua Bowen, or Dan McClellan, or my friend Justin, Deconstruction Zone. Because some of us start reading the Bible closely and we start noticing weird things. Names changing, stories repeating, contradictions, genealogies that don't quite fit together. And then suddenly you hear a scholar use a word like doublet and you're sitting there like, what the hell is a doublet? Or maybe you hear the term textual criticism or documentary hypothesis. That can all sound intimidating. Maybe you have heard textual criticism is just atheists attacking the Bible, but that's not actually what textual criticism is. So before I go on talking about Esau's wives and doublets and all this stuff, we need to take a minute and explain some of these terms first, because I do not make my sermons for Bible scholars. My sermons are for women just like me, women who were handed apologetics instead of answers, women who were told, don't question it, just have faith. God said it, that settles it. If God calls you to it, He'll see you through it. And 57 other Christian bumper sticker slogans. But then one day we actually read the Bible and suddenly we notice things nobody prepared us for. So let's start simple. Textual criticism is basically the study of how ancient texts got written, copied, edited, translated, and passed down over time. That's it. That sounds way less scary when you say it like that, right? Because the reality is the Bible did not float down from heaven in leather binding with gold-edged papers and Jesus' words in red. Human beings wrote these texts. Human beings copied these texts. Human beings preserved these stories. Human beings put Jesus' words in red, and ancient people did not preserve stories the way we do today. Today, if you write a book, you probably have one author, one final draft, one official version. Ancient cultures did not work like that. A lot of these stories existed orally first, meaning people told them out loud for generations. Families passed them down. Tribes passed them down. Communities passed them down. And sometimes different communities preserved different versions of the same core story. That is where some of these weird inconsistencies come from. Justin explained this in a way I thought was really helpful. He said, imagine two neighboring communities both preserving stories about the same historical event. Over time, the stories start sounding a little different. One group remembers certain details, another group remembers different details. One changes names, one changes locations. One emphasizes one character more than another. And then later, somebody tries to merge those traditions together into one larger national story. That is much closer to what scholars think happened with parts of Genesis. Not one guy sitting alone writing a perfect book from beginning to end, but generations of people preserving traditions and eventually combining them together. And when those stories get merged, sometimes you still see the seams. That is where terms like doublet come in. A doublet is basically when two stories in the Bible look suspiciously similar. Like, wait, didn't this already happen? Sarah gets taken by a ruler, then a similar thing happens again. Water comes from a rock, then later water comes from a rock again. And then we get to Esau's wives, where suddenly names overlap but fathers don't match. One woman has one father in one chapter and another father in another chapter, and instead of pretending nobody notices that, scholars study it because inconsistencies can tell us something about how the text developed over time. And studying how a text developed is normal. We do this with ancient history all the time. Scholars study Homer, Egyptian text, Roman history, and those texts talk about gods and supernatural events too. Many of the scholars studying those texts do not personally believe those events literally happened, but nobody panics when historians compare copies of Julius Caesar's manuscripts. The second an atheist studies the Bible historically, though, people lose their minds. Now, another term you will hear is documentary hypothesis. And honestly, when I first heard that phrase, I thought it had something to do with somebody making a movie about the Bible, like the documentary hypothesis. I was like, oh, okay, Ken Burns presents Exodus. But that's not what it means. The basic idea is actually pretty simple. Biblical scholars notice that parts of the Bible sometimes sound like they came from different sources or traditions that eventually got woven together. Different writing styles, different names for God, different repeated stories, different genealogies, different political viewpoints. And scholars started asking, what if these stories came from multiple traditions that eventually got edited together? That is the documentary hypothesis in the most basic everyday language possible. And this is where you will sometimes hear scholars use terms like J, E, P, and D. Now don't panic. These are not secret Bible codes. They are just labels scholars use for different traditions or source groups they think may exist inside the first books of the Bible. J stands for the Yahwist source because it tends to use the divine name Yahweh. E stands for the Elohist source because it tends to use Elohim. P stands for priestly source because it focuses heavily on priesthoods, genealogies, purity laws, rituals, measurements, temple systems, and order. And D stands for Deuteronomist, because scholars think parts of Deuteronomy and related material share a similar style and theology. Now, before somebody in the comments starts hyperventilating, this does not mean scholars found 4 original Bibles hidden in a cave somewhere. That is not what anybody is saying. Scholars are looking at patterns, writing styles, repeated stories, political viewpoints, divine names, contradictions, genealogies. And over time, they started noticing, hey, these sections sound different from each other. Kind of like how if you listen to enough podcasts, eventually you can recognize which host is talking just by their tone and wording. That is basically what scholars are doing with biblical texts. Once somebody points it out, you start seeing it everywhere. The more closely you read Genesis, the more sense this starts to make because suddenly weird things stop feeling random. Now you start seeing ancient people trying to preserve sacred traditions from different communities and merge them together instead of throwing any away. And personally, That made the Bible more interesting to me, not less, because now I'm not looking at a flat storybook. Now I'm looking at ancient tribes, ancient politics, migration, war, refugees, storytelling, memory, communities trying to preserve identity after collapse. And that is fucking fascinating. And I think every woman should know this too. How the rabbis explain the problem. Now, obviously, Jewish rabbis noticed these contradictions too, because contrary to what some Christians seem to think, people in the ancient world were not stupid. They could read. They noticed when names changed. They noticed when genealogies did not line up. They noticed when one woman seemed to disappear and another suddenly appeared. So the rabbis had to wrestle with these verses too. And traditionally, most rabbinic explanations tried to harmonize the lists instead of treating them like contradictions. Meaning, instead of saying these are different traditions stitched together, they usually tried to explain how the verses could still fit together as one unified story. One of the most common explanations was that some of the women may have had multiple names, and honestly, that is not unusual for the ancient world. People could have family names, regional names, nicknames, titles, marriage names, or names connected to personal traits. So rather than seeing separate women in every version of the genealogy, many rabbis tried to identify which women they believed were actually the same person appearing under different names. This is especially important when we get to the places where one woman seems to disappear and another suddenly appears in her place. Traditional Jewish interpreters often tried to preserve continuity instead of assuming the text was preserving competing traditions. Some rabbis also suggested that certain names functioned more like descriptions than strict legal birth names, which connects back to something I talked about earlier when I mentioned my conversation with Justin. Sometimes names in ancient storytelling almost feel attached to memorable characteristics, family roles, or identity markers. Meaning over generations, a descriptor can slowly become attached to the person themselves. Another thing rabbis focused heavily on was genealogy, because genealogy mattered enormously in the ancient world. Lineage determined inheritance, tribal identity, political legitimacy, religious status, and land rights. So genealogies were not always trying to function like modern biographies. They were often trying to preserve tribal and family relationships. And that helps explain why some Genesis genealogies feel strange to modern readers. Because we tend to read genealogy like Ancestry.com. Ancient people often used genealogy more like political and tribal storytelling. Now here is something important though. Even when rabbis harmonized these stories, they were still acknowledging the problem existed. That matters because sometimes modern Christians act like noticing contradictions means you hate the Bible. But Jewish interpreters have been wrestling with difficult passages for centuries. Questioning difficult verses is not new. Trying to reconcile inconsistencies is not new. The rabbis notice these problems too. They just approach the problem differently than modern biblical scholarship tends to approach it. Christian apologetic explanations. Now, if you go looking for Christian apologetic explanations for all of this, most of them begin with one central assumption. There cannot be a contradiction. That is the starting point, not what happened here. Not why do these traditions differ, but how can these verses still fit together without error? And once that becomes the goal, the entire approach changes. Because apologetics is usually not trying to determine whether tension exists in the text. It is trying to explain why the tension does not count as contradiction. So most Christian apologetic explanations for Esau's wives fall into a few major categories. The first is the multiple names theory. This is probably the most common explanation. Apologists will argue that women in the ancient world often had more than one name, so Adah and Basemath may be the same woman, or Mahalath and Basemath may be the same woman. For example, the Christian commentary tradition around Genesis 36 often argues that Basemath, listed as Ishmael's daughter, is actually Mahalath under another name because both women are described as daughters of Ishmael and sisters of Nebaioth. Meanwhile, Adah is often identified with the earlier Basemath connected to Elon the Hittite. and Oholibamah is sometimes identified with Judith. That is the standard harmonization attempt. Another apologetic explanation focuses on selective genealogy. In other words, the list may not have been intended as full modern-style records. Some Christian commentators argue that Genesis 26 gives one version of Esau's wives early in the story, while Genesis 36 reflects later tribal or political genealogies connected to Edom. Others argue one list may emphasize ethnicity, while another emphasizes inheritance lines or clan structures. Some will argue these are not contradictions because ancient genealogies routinely skip details, rename people, or collapse generations. And to be fair, ancient genealogies really did work differently than modern family records. But this is where apologetics often starts becoming extremely complicated, because now you are trying to explain why names changed, why fathers changed, why women disappear, why new women appear, and why the lists do not line up cleanly. And usually at that point, the apologetic answer becomes something like, there's probably an explanation even if we no longer know exactly what it is. You can see this kind of reasoning in many conservative Christian study Bibles and apologetic ministries. Writers like Gleason Archer, Norman Geisler, and organizations like Got Questions or Answers in Genesis often approach these passages assuming harmony must exist even if the exact reconstruction is uncertain. And this is where I think the conversation gets really important. Because whether you are a rabbi harmonizing the text, a Christian apologist harmonizing the text, or a modern scholar proposing source traditions, you're still acknowledging the same reality. There is something in the text that requires explanation. Nobody builds elaborate harmonizations for passages that are perfectly straightforward. Nobody creates charts, genealogical reconstructions, alternate name theories, and timeline arguments unless there is visible tension sitting in the text itself. That is the point. And I think sometimes apologetics becomes so focused on defending the perfection of the text that it stops allowing the text to simply be ancient. Ancient texts are messy. Oral traditions are messy. Genealogies are messy. Human memory is messy. Family histories are messy. And I think there is something more intellectually honest about admitting, yes, this is complicated, than pretending every problem disappears if we just rearrange enough names on a chart. Another thing worth mentioning here is that scholarship itself has evolved far beyond the old simplistic versions people argue about online. A lot of Christians still talk about the documentary hypothesis as if scholars universally teach one neat JEPD system, exactly the way it was taught 100 years ago. But modern scholarship has become much more complicated than that. Some scholars still use JEPD language. Some modify it heavily. Some argue for additional editorial layers. Some think certain sources were combined much later than originally proposed. Some think the old Wellhausen model was too neat and too rigid. Even some Christian Old Testament scholars acknowledge that the Pentateuch likely went through multiple stages of composition and editing. So even scholarship itself continues evolving, because scholarship changes when new evidence, new methods, and new ideas emerge. That is how historical study works. And for me personally, watching people wrestle honestly with difficult texts is far more interesting than pretending the difficulties are not there at all. So if you've heard any of my Auntie Sermons before, then you already know the Bible is not the only source talking about these people and genealogies. Ancient Jewish writers, historians, and religious traditions continued talking about biblical figures long after Genesis was written. And sometimes those later traditions tried to explain confusing passages too. One major example is Josephus. Josephus was a first century Jewish historian writing during the time of the Roman Empire. And what's interesting is that when Josephus retells biblical history, he often cleans things up. He smooths over tension. He reorganizes confusing material. He retells stories in ways that feel more unified and easier to follow. And you can actually see him doing that with Esau's wives. In Genesis, the genealogy feels unstable. Judith disappears. Mahalath seems to become Basemath. Adah suddenly appears attached to Elon. The names shift. The fathers shift. The lists refuse to line up clearly. But when Josephus retells the story in Antiquities of the Jews, he basically streamlines the wives into one cleaner genealogy. Instead of sitting in all the confusion and contradiction, Josephus presents Esau's wives more cleanly as Adah, Oholibamah, and Basemath. He does not spend time wrestling with, wait, is Mahalath the same woman as Basemath? He does not stop and ask, what happened to Judith? He simply smooths the genealogy into something more organized and easier for readers to follow. And that is exactly the point. Josephus is showing us that ancient readers recognized the genealogy was difficult too. Because if the genealogy already read perfectly clearly, there would be no reason to reorganize it. Then you have the text like Jubilees. The book of Jubilees is an ancient Jewish retelling of Genesis and Exodus, and Jubilees loves adding details, extra names, extra timelines, extra explanations, especially for women. Women who remain unnamed in Genesis suddenly get names in later traditions. And what that tells me is that ancient readers were uncomfortable with silence in the text too. They wanted complete family lines. They wanted explanations. They wanted the stories organized because oral tradition is messy. Stories shift over generations. Names change pronunciation. Families merge. Tribes merge. Communities migrate. Political alliances change, and genealogies in the ancient world were not functioning the way modern people think family records function. Today we think genealogies mean birth certificates, exact dates, legal documents, DNA tests. Ancient genealogies often functioned more like tribal memory. They preserved alliances, inheritance, land claims, ethnic identity, religious legitimacy, and political relationships. Sometimes genealogy was less about here is every exact biological detail and more about here is who belongs to us. And once you understand that, Genesis starts reading very differently because now these genealogies are not just random lists of names. They are identity documents, political documents, tribal documents, and oral tradition complicated all that even further because oral storytelling cultures preserve stories differently than written cultures do. Certain names become more important. Certain stories grow. Some traditions survive in one region and disappear in another. And Justin and I talked about this too when we were discussing how multiple communities can preserve different versions of the same core tradition. And once those traditions eventually get merged together, sometimes you can still see fingerprints of the older traditions underneath. That is why scholars study naming customs so carefully, because names in the ancient world were much more fluid than modern Western readers are used to. A person might be known by a birth name, a clan identity, a title, a nickname, a regional variation, or a name translated into another language tradition. And women especially became unstable in genealogical records because women were often recorded relationally. Daughter of, sister of, wife of, mother of. Their identity was constantly tied to male lineage structures. So when traditions merged over centuries, women's names became especially vulnerable to confusion, replacement, overlap, reinterpretation, and erasure. Which brings us right back to Esau's wives, because when you place these women inside the reality of oral traditions, tribal genealogy, shifting names, and centuries of retelling, the confusion stops feeling accidental. It starts feeling exactly like what happens when ancient traditions evolve across generations while different communities try to preserve them, bringing it back to the women. So now you understand why this sermon became so complicated. You understand why when I got to these women, it was not easy to just sit down and write one clean sermon about each of them. Because half of the time I was trying to figure out who was who. Which woman became which woman? Which names matched? Which traditions overlapped? And at times, the whole genealogy felt like trying to untangle a pile of necklaces that had been sitting in a jewelry box for 50 or 60 years. You pull one chain and somehow 3 more tighten. Now we understand why. We understand doublets. We understand oral traditions. We understand the documentary hypothesis. We understand source traditions. We understand why ancient genealogies became unstable in the first place. So now that we've walked through all of that, I want to bring it back to the women themselves. Because underneath all the scholarship and all the tangled genealogy, there are still women sitting inside this story. And some of them we've already talked about. Judith, Basemath. In my sermon, Judith and Basemath, Ride or Die, we talked about how those women aligned themselves with Esau, and his parents hated it. Genesis tells us outright that these marriages grieved Isaac and Rebekah. And I know many of you know exactly how families sometimes react when the black sheep of the family finally finds somebody willing to stand beside them, somebody who aligns with them. Because once somebody starts validating the person the family has scapegoated, suddenly the new wife, friend, or companion becomes the problem too. I don't like her. She's bad for you. You've changed since you met her. She's turning you against us. That is the tension I see sitting underneath Esau's marriages to Judith and Basemath. Because Esau never actually comes across to me as some hateful, bitter monster. When Jacob returns later, Esau runs to him with his arms wide open. Jacob thinks he is going to be murdered. Instead, Esau embraces him. They fall on each other's necks and weep. That is not the behavior of a man consumed by hatred. So when Esau realizes his parents disapprove of his marriages, what does he do? Does he confront the deeper family dysfunction? No. He tries to solve the problem by bringing in yet another woman, Mahalath or Basemath, depending on which tradition you're reading. Genesis 28 basically presents the marriage like this. Oh, my parents don't like my wives from Canaan? Okay, then maybe if I marry somebody from Abraham's family line, they'll finally approve of me. And I think a lot of women are going to recognize that dynamic immediately. Because women get brought into broken systems all the time and are expected to fix something they did not break. A man has tension with his parents, bring a wife to stabilize him. A family reputation is shaky, bring in the right kind of woman. A wealthy family has a son, they're worried about embarrassing them, find him a respectable wife. A politician has image problems, suddenly a woman appears smiling beside him at campaign events and press conferences. A man is emotionally immature, everybody acts like marriage will magically turn him into a functioning adult. Women are constantly treated like emotional support scaffolding for broken systems within a man's world, and the pressure placed on those women is enormous. Fix him, calm him down, make him respectable, help him reconcile with his family. And sometimes the woman herself starts believing it too. If I just love him enough, if I'm patient enough, if I become the woman he needs, maybe his family will finally accept him. But marriage does not fix unresolved family dysfunction. Another woman cannot heal wounds that existed long before she arrived. And we still see this happen in modern times. Look at Ted Kennedy and Joan Bennett Kennedy. Ted Kennedy came from one of the most powerful political families in America's history. Charismatic, wild, heavy drinking, womanizing, constant scandal. And according to many historians and biographers, the Kennedy family believed marriage would help stabilize his image. So Joan Bennett was brought in as the perfect political wife. Beautiful, respectable, educated. The kind of woman who could stand beside a powerful man and make him look mature and trustworthy. But marriage did not fix Ted Kennedy because women are not rehabilitation centers for broken men. And while Ted continued spiraling through scandal after scandal, Joan was the one collapsing under the pressure. Public humiliation, infidelity, alcoholism, the pressure of constantly performing the role of the perfect political wife while the dysfunction underneath never actually changed. And when I look at Mahalath entering Esau's family after he realizes his parents disapprove of his life choices, that is the kind of dynamic I see. A woman brought into an already existing family problem with the hope that her presence will somehow repair what was already broken long before she arrived. That's what men do sometimes instead of fixing what is wrong with them. They lean on a woman. They lean on her emotionally, spiritually, socially, publicly. And sometimes they lean so hard that eventually the woman underneath them starts collapsing because she was never supposed to carry the full weight of another person's unresolved trauma, family dysfunction, reputation, addiction, immaturity, insecurity, or emotional instability. That is too much weight for one human being. And I think there is something deeply sad about the way Mahalath enters this story. She enters it as a solution, not as a person. Not because Esau suddenly had some great revelation about who she was, but because he realized, my parents are unhappy with me. And instead of confronting the deeper issue, another woman gets folded into the family system, hoping her presence will calm the tension. Women have been carrying that burden for men for thousands of years. And some of you listening to me right now know exactly what that feels like. You became the stabilizer, the fixer, the emotional support system, the peacemaker, the respectable face, the woman everybody hoped would somehow heal a broken man. And maybe you loved him. Maybe you genuinely thought, if I love him enough, maybe things will finally get better. But love by itself cannot heal dysfunction that somebody refuses to confront. And one of the hardest lessons many women ever learn is this: you cannot carry somebody into emotional maturity. They have to choose it themselves. Closing. Human storytelling. And so what is the lesson? Well, for me, I think the biggest thing Esau's wives have taught me is that the problem has never been that there is some God up in the sky who thought women were not worth remembering. Their story actually points me in the opposite direction entirely, because this does not read like divine storytelling. It reads like human storytelling. Human storytelling is messy. It forgets things. People mix up names. They forget dates, they confuse places. Stories get stitched together. Communities preserve different versions. Families remember things differently. And women especially get blurred together in patriarchal systems where their identities are tied to fathers, husbands, brothers, and sons. That is what Esau's wives feel like to me. Not evidence of a God who hated women, but evidence of human beings trying to preserve stories across generations without realizing how much would eventually become tangled together. And once you look at it through that lens, so much of the Bible suddenly makes more sense. Of course, names get mixed up. Do you know how many times my own parents called me by my siblings' names growing up? My mom has called me by my dog's names before. And to be honest, I've probably done it to my own children too. Now imagine a world without recording devices, no audio recordings, no printed books, no phones, no cloud storage, no Google Docs, no easy way to preserve stories except oral tradition. A father tells a story but accidentally says one daughter's name instead of another. A brother repeats the story slightly differently years later. A community preserves one version. Another community preserves another version. Then centuries pass, the stories merge together, and eventually later readers are left trying to figure out, wait, which woman was this originally about? That is the reality we are dealing with. Not some divine supercomputer perfectly dictating every syllable from heaven. Human beings told these stories. Human beings preserved these stories. Human beings stitched these traditions together over centuries. And human beings carry biases. They carry prejudices. They carry patriarchy. And because women were often not valued equally in these ancient systems, women's identities became especially vulnerable to confusion, overlap, reinterpretation, and erasure. And strangely enough, that explanation makes far more sense to me than trying to believe there is an all-knowing God somewhere intentionally scrambling women's identities while demanding we call that confusion perfect. No, this looks human, deeply human, beautiful sometimes, painful sometimes, wise sometimes, cruel sometimes, contradictory sometimes. Exactly what you would expect from ancient tribes trying to answer the great questions of life through storytelling, memory, religion, survival, and identity. And maybe there's another lesson hiding underneath all of this too. Women are not here to fix men. Women are not emotional rehabilitation centers. Women are not support scaffolding for unresolved male dysfunction. Men have to do their own work. Men have to confront their own pain. Men have to go to therapy. Men have to learn emotional maturity. They need to cry. They need to express themselves. They need friendship, softness, honesty. Men need to stop being taught that vulnerability makes them weak. If a man wants healing, he cannot keep outsourcing that labor onto women. No wife can carry somebody into emotional maturity for him. He has to choose growth himself. And maybe that is one final thing these women teach us. When societies refuse to value women as full human beings, women become blurred together. Used, repositioned, forgotten, expected to stabilize systems they did not create. But here we are, thousands of years later, pulling their names back out of the tangle, holding each strand up to the light and saying, you were not the problem. You were not the footnote. You were not just somebody's daughter, somebody's wife, somebody's fix, somebody's solution. You were women. And even if the story forgot how to hold you clearly, we will not. And that's today's Auntie Sermon. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to like, comment, rate, or review the podcast. It really helps more people find the show. And if you'd like to support the podcast financially, check out my link tree in the show notes. There are several ways you can support the show and the work that I do. You can also find me on TikTok and YouTube. I am Crystal J, Crystaljae. And remember, I'm Nice Lady.